Hello and welcome to Archive West Texas. I'm your host, Gordon Wilkerson, joined as always by our producer, Rachel Boyd. On this program, we visit with individuals whose lives and work have helped shape the character and history of our region. We're honored today to welcome Dr. D.L. Lowrie, longtime pastor of First Baptist Church in Lubbock, as our guest. Over more than 6 decades in ministry, he served congregations across Texas and Tennessee, mentored generations of young ministers, and provided spiritual leadership to communities throughout our region. DL, welcome to Archive West Texas.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Your story really begins in Tennessee. Tell us where you're from.
Well, a little over 90 years ago, I was born on a mountainside, literally, in East Tennessee, Sullivan County. The nearest town of any size was Bluff City, which was 5-6 miles away. But nearby were Bristol, Johnson City, Kingsport, up in the northeastern corner of Tennessee. I was born there May the 18th, 1935.
So that's the middle of the Great Depression. And how large was your community?
Well, my dad and mother, when they got married, they moved into a little cabin up on the side of the mountain, almost a mile from the nearest road. But they didn't need a road. They didn't have a car. So we walked up and down that mountainside until I was 8 years old. My dad was a country mountain school teacher. He taught in a little one-room school, had about 30 students usually, and taught 7 grades. I walked to school, the Chinkapin Grove School, which was not that far from where he taught, but yet it was a school with 4 teachers. We had 8 grades and 4 teachers. And that's where my life started.
Tell us about your mother.
Well, my mother was 17 years old when she married my dad. My dad was 25, or I think maybe 24 when they got married. And I was born a year later. They married in May of 34, and I was born in May of 35. But my mother, she was the oldest of 9 children. And I say of my grandmother, her mother, my grandmother Smith, for the first 20 years of her marriage to my granddad, she was pregnant. She would have a child, and then 2 years later, she'd have another child, another child, another child. And my mother was the oldest. And when my mother was 6th grade, she had to drop out of school, stay at home, and become an adult because she had to help raise these newborns in the family. And she did that until she married my dad when she was 17. My mother became a sophisticated, educated woman, but she only went to school six years. My dad, of course, had been a school teacher, though that didn't mean he was a sophisticated school teacher. My dad had been to college 1 year when he became a school teacher, which was not unusual in the mountains. When I was in the 4th grade, my teacher in the 4th grade and the 3rd grade, she had both grades. When she became my teacher, she graduated from high school in May, started teaching me and my classmates in September. So she'd had 1 summer at the college and she became our teacher. So that's the setting. My mother was a very strong and significant part of our lives, though. When she was 16 years old, our church, our home church, had a season of revival, and my mother became a Christian. Her family had never attended church, and she became a very strong believer and a good mother, good wife. She really made a difference in my life and my brothers and my sister.
Who were some teachers or mentors that you had as a young boy in Tennessee?
Well, my greatest influence, other than my parents, was my grandfather, my mother's father. He had 9 children. Only one of them was a boy. And JT didn't live, but I think a year and a half. My memory is that I think he got pneumonia or something and died as a child. So when I was born into the family, the son of his oldest daughter and his first grandchild, he really adopted me in a special way and was always there for me and interested in my life and was a big help in my life. My granddad was more of a mountain entrepreneur, I guess. He had businesses and did different things, but he was a big influence in my life. And then obviously people in my church, we were very much a member of the local church, the Chinkapin Grove Baptist Church, which was a good, strong country church. It was a long ways to anywhere from where we lived.
After you graduated from high school, you attended Carson Newsom College and then later East Tennessee State?
I did. I graduated from high school, the Bluff City High School. That was 5 miles from where I grew up. Rode the bus. My next door neighbor and I, we caught the bus at 7 o'clock. Our bus driver was a neighbor of ours, and he owned the bus and had the bus route. And then we would get to school. We were always the first one to get there. And then we'd be the last to leave because he had to take us home last. So it would be 5:30, 6 o'clock by the time we got home in the evening. After high school, during the summer, I didn't have any idea what I was going to do. Not everybody I knew went to college. In fact, very few people went to college. And my family went to Ridgecrest, North Carolina, to a Baptist conference during the summer. And while I was there as a high school senior with my mother and my family, there was a whole group of students from Carson Newman College. That's where my dad had started the college years earlier. And I was so impressed with them that I had developed a desire to go to Carson Newman. So I came home. It was in August and told my dad, I want to go to Carson Newman. Well, I had no money. He had no money. We got in his car and we drove down to Jefferson City and checked. And sure enough, they accepted me. I came back home. A year's college at Carson Newman would cost $600. I didn't have anything. I had what few dollars somebody had given me from graduating from high school. So I went to, my dad took me, we went to an old uncle of mine, my dad's uncle, and I asked Uncle Willie, it took $150 to get in. I said, would you loan me $150 so I can get into college? So he said, well, sure. He went back in the back bedroom and I suppose got under the mattress or somewhere. And he came back $150 cash and put it in my hands. And my dad and mother took me back to Jefferson City, and that's how I started. I borrowed $150. And in the good providence of God, I felt the call in my heart on a Sunday morning at the Northside Baptist Church in Jefferson City. What I answered the call. There come into my heart a sense of calling from God to be a pastor. And I went forward at the church and let the people know that I was going to change directions and would be pursuing the ministry. So 1953, October, I made that commitment. And here I am all these years later, and still in a feeble way as a 90-year-old man is trying to pursue the same calling.
Still living that. That's great.
Still doing it, yeah.
DL, your first experience as a pastor came at Biltmore Baptist Church in Elizabethton. Am I saying that correctly, Tennessee?
No, you're not.
All right. So.
It's Elizabethton.
Elizabethton. Okay. All right.
Elizabethan.
Got that straight.
Interestingly, people who might hear us in Lubbock and surrounding, Elizabethan is the hometown of Jason Witten, who played for the Cowboys, and Evan Carter, who now plays for the Rangers. They too were from Elizabethton, which was a few miles from my home. So in the spring of 1954, while I was still at Carson Newman, I was home for the spring holidays, and my pastor at my home church gave my name to the Biltmore Church. They were without a pastor. They were splintered. They were, well, back in those days, you, Gordon, and those listening, or unless they're old, they wouldn't remember this kind of thing. But in the 50s, there was a lot of confusion in churches, particularly small churches, and particularly in the mountains where I grew up, over new translations of the Bible. And the Biltmore Church had a pastor who had been to college and was educated somewhat. And one Sunday he preached out of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Well, during that week he was fired for preaching out of something beside the King James Version. And about half of the church left because they fired the pastor. And I went to preach on this Sunday morning. I didn't know a soul there. And I preached that Sunday. I'd only preached 8 times, and all of them had been at my home church. But after I preached, I was 18 years old. They asked me to come back and preach the next Sunday if I would. So I went back and preached the next Sunday. And after I preached the next Sunday, one of the older men came up to me and he said, would you consider being our pastor? Well, I didn't know what to say. And I said to him, his name was Charlie Lyons. He was the oldest deacon in the church. I said, well, I would be willing to pray about it. Well, the outcome of that was during my freshman year in college, while I was still at Carson Newman, I became the pastor of the Biltmore Church. They ran at that point, after their splintering, about 40, 50 people. And I didn't have a car, so I'd catch a ride each weekend up to Elizabeth, and well, really to my home, which was only 10 miles or so from there. And I became their pastor. And so the next year in the fall, I enrolled at East Tennessee State and finished my education there while pastoring this church.
Tell our listeners how you met Alice.
When I was 19 years old, still going to college full time and still pastoring the church, a friend of mine who'd been my pastor, in fact, it was the man as my pastor that baptized me to the church when I was 12 years old. He invited me to go with him to a Bible conference in Mississippi. He was now pastoring in Knoxville. And so he and another friend of mine, and we went to Myrtle, Mississippi, which was Alice's hometown. And they had a pastor's Bible conference there. When we got there on Monday night, the service was already underway, and we slipped into the service. It was a relatively small Baptist congregation, and a trio of girls were singing, high school girls. Alice was one of those girls. Her 2 best friends, they were the singing special for the church. And I noticed her without any knowledge. We didn't know anybody there. We went in late, slipped in, and when we sat down, I sat down by her mother, who was seated close to the front. And after the service that night, we introduced ourselves to each other, met these girls, and I was there for that week, and we began the courtship by mail through those years. And she was, until we were married in 1958, our courtship was by mail. And once in a while, I'd slip off to Mississippi and spend a couple of nights and a day and we got to know each other. So in August of 1958, we were married to each other, been married for 67 years now.
Wow, that's wonderful. That's a great story. Ultimately, you made the decision to attend Southwestern Seminary. That's a big switch from the Appalachian and Smoky Mountains down to the hot and dry plains of Texas. Tell us how you reached that decision and what Southwestern Seminary was like in those years.
Well, that's an interesting part of our story. We were married August the 1st, 1958. August the 22nd, we put everything we had in a very small U-Haul trailer, and we drove to Fort Worth, Texas. Got there the next day, and Alice had graduated with a degree in education, so she'd gotten a job. She'd gone out before we were married to Arlington and had got a teaching position, teaching fifth grade in the Arlington school system. But we drove out. I'd never been west of Memphis. That's as far west as I'd ever been. So we drove from Myrtle, Mississippi, her home, to Fort Worth. Got there in the middle of the day. We'd stopped along the way and spent the night. And my attraction to Southwestern Seminary, I'd read some books by Dr. B.H. Carroll, who was the founding president of the seminary, Dr. L.R. Scarborough, who was the second president of the seminary. I'd heard one professor speak one time, Dr. Cal Guy, who taught missions at the seminary. And there were two Baptist seminaries that were much closer living in East Tennessee. There was the Southern Seminary in Louisville. There was the Southeastern Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina. But I'd always enjoyed reading cowboy stories and Zane Grey and about Texas and the West. And I just had an attraction in that area. So we ended up in Fort Worth, and I enrolled in seminary. She started teaching school. My years at Southwestern were a real blessing. I really needed, I'd graduated at a state university. That doesn't prepare you for ministry mostly, So it was good to be able to learn a whole lot more about the Bible and theology and history and the things that a would-be pastor needed. And Southwestern was a really strong school in those days. I started to seminary the same year that Dr. Robert Naylor became the president of the seminary. And those were very good years in Baptist life and in my life.
Yes, they were. Who were some of your most memorable professors? Who influenced you significantly at Southwestern?
At the top of the list would be a fellow Tennessean, Dr. Curtis Vaughn. He was a young man then, but he'd grown up in Memphis. So I had a little bit of connection with him. The first class I had in seminary was in Greek in his class, and that was an introduction. And he became my New Testament Greek professor and was influenced and encouraged by him. Dr. Robert Baker was a history professor. I minored in history in college and I enjoyed the history part of seminary life. Dr. Boyd Hunt was my theology professor, and he was a blessing and a wonderful teacher. Dr. C.E. Autry was the teacher of evangelism, and he influenced everybody that was in his classes. I've already mentioned Dr. Cal Guy was the missions professor. And Dr. Naylor, as the president of the school, later became a real friend when I pastored in Fort Worth. But they were all an influence in my life.
After graduating from Southwestern, instead of going back to Tennessee, you're called to First Baptist Church Lorenzo.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that might have been a culture shock a little bit for someone from Tennessee. That's got to be a great story. Tell us how you accepted that call.
Well, there was a man who pastored the Northside Baptist Church in Weatherford during seminary. I became pastor of the Oak Ridge Baptist Church. And the North Side Church was the largest church in Weatherford. And Joe Griffin had been pastor there, and he'd moved there from Abernathy. He was pastor of First Baptist Church in Abernathy. And he called me one day and said, DL, there's a church in West Texas, First Baptist Church Lorenzo. He said, they need a pastor, and I'd like to recommend you there. And I said, well, Joe, I don't know anything about Lorenzo. I've never been really west of Weatherford here, but I allowed Joe to give my name, and the committee from that church, they came to Weatherford and to meet us and to hear me preach. Well, this seems like maybe a repetition of the story. They just fired their pastor over some different issues. It didn't have to do with the King James Version here in Texas, but the deacons in the church, some of them were part of the building of the country club at Lorenzo, which had a golf course, which had a 19th hole or whatever. And the pastor at the First Baptist Church, he opposed building a country club and the golf course. So he got crossways with the deacons. So one Wednesday night at a business meeting, they fired him. And in this case, there was no place for people to go. They was going to go to a Baptist church. They just won in town. So, but I had 7 deacons when I got there, and every issue we voted on was 4-3. They never agreed on anything. That's where I started. But I was only pastor there 2 years, but 2 wonderful years, the 2 greatest years Lorenzo ever had in attendance. It was just a remarkable time. And God opened the door for us to move into Lubbock to Calvary Baptist Church in 1964.
And Calvary at the time was just east of Lubbock High on 19th Street. Is that right?
That's right beside Lubbock High School, within walking distance of First Baptist Church. And I walked those streets all around that part of the town, knocking on doors. That's all I knew to do. And trying to build, I'd never lived in a city, never pastored a city church. Calvary at that point, they had 1 staff member, they had a couple of secretaries. For me, that was a different world to try to learn to work with a staff and so forth. But during those years, I got to know some key people at First Baptist Church, particularly Dr. Grant and Lattimore Ewing, and really became friends with a lot of the people at First Baptist.
Then in 1967, you were called back to Fort Worth. Is that right?
I went back to Fort Worth. I promised myself when I graduated seminary that I would never pastor in Fort Worth. Well, if you're going to follow God, you ought never use the word never, because I ended up being pastor of the North Fort Worth Baptist Church. North Fort Worth Baptist Church was over in the old part of Fort Worth, not far from the stockyards, not far from the roughest part of Fort Worth. It was a church that ran 700-800 people. Dr. Morgan had been their pastor 27 years, had moved to the First Baptist Church in Hurst. So it was a new experience for me, a larger staff and a larger congregation. And 10 of the most satisfying years of ministry I ever had was at North Fort Worth, because in the providence of God, we began to attract seminary students. They had to drive all the way across town over to that community around North Fort Worth, which was now a predominantly Hispanic community. In fact, when our boys, David and Steve, started to school, they were in bilingual classes, because where we lived in the old parsonage, it was 90% Hispanic. But the congregation had a few Hispanic, but it was primarily Anglo people that drove into church there. We attracted hundreds of seminary students for those years. So consequently, we had friends all over the world, because we had So many of these that went on to be pastors and missionaries around the world. Still have many of those friends today. But the Norfolk Work Church was 10 wonderful years of successful ministry, good ministry.
Then you were called to First Baptist Texarkana. Is that correct?
I was only there 3 years, but 3 wonderful years. First Baptist Texarkana is a great church and prospered through the years since then, made some very significant decisions in my years there. But Lubbock came on the scene then.
Looking back on those early years in your ministry, could you have imagined one day that you'd be called back to Lubbock to First Baptist?
Never. When I came to First Baptist in 1980, it was not a good time at First Baptist. After Dr. Weber retired, they'd spent 2 years without a pastor. I say they, you did, you were there then. And they finally called Dr. Fred Wolf from Mobile, Alabama, to be their pastor. And there was great excitement. I mean, they'd been looking forward after Dr. Weber. Dr. Weber's last years had been limited because of heart issues and health issues, which took him in death not too long after he left the church. So the church was profoundly disappointed when Fred, after 6 months, decided that he made a mistake, and without consulting the church or anybody else, he moved back to Mobile. And they had been just a few months without a pastor. But they'd had a pulpit committee of 12 people when they called Fred. 12 of the strongest, most significant people in the church. And they'd spent 2 years looking for a pastor. I think they started with Billy Graham and worked down. They heard every important preacher in America during those, some Baptist preacher. Well, the church decided maybe we need to do something different. So they selected 5 outstanding men in the church to be the search committee, and they started out looking for a pastor. Latimer Ewing was a great servant at First Baptist. Early days, he was minister of education. He'd become we'd probably call him today an executive pastor. He really kept the church going for Dr. Grant and was just a great influence in the life of the church. Well, Latimer said to Pal Adams, "You guys ought to check out D.L. Lowrie." None of them knew me or knew anything about me. So I think the first visit they tried to make, they came to Texarkana. We talked, and the Lord put us together in a meaningful way. And in September of 1980, I came before the church in view of a call. It was the most unexciting call, I'm sure, that First Baptist ever gave anybody, because a good percentage of the people weren't ready for a new pastor. But we came, and God gave us 6 wonderful years there. The first ones were difficult, but once it happened, it happened. We had a good 6 years. At the end of 6 years, we were together, and the church was moving forward in a good way.
Absolutely. Dee, I want to thank you for joining us today. You've given us a great illustration of how faith, leadership, and service shape both communities and lives. We're going to ask Dr. Lowrie to continue with us for our next episode. Thanks for listening today. Please join us again next week for another episode of Archive West Texas.